Hello and welcome to part 1 of my Japan video diaries. Earlier this year in February, Anthea and I spent about 3-ish weeks traveling Japan. We went to Tokyo, Hakuba, Kyoto, Osaka and a bunch of other places along the way. It was also my first time ever going to Japan, so I feel like we hit all the major must-go-to places. And we did a lot and we saw a lot, but because the trip was so jam-packed, I felt that I never really had the time to talk directly to the camera. It almost felt like a chore to kind of narrate the day, and I think when you are traveling at a more fast-paced nature, it is just nicer to be present, just to film stuff and not feel like you have to constantly kind of keep up with the video diary aspect. But I knew I wanted to make a video diary out of the footage that I did get during my time there, because obviously I just whip it out all the time but just never talk to the camera. But what I was able to do was keep up pretty consistently with my written journal. I kept a journal because we went to New Zealand before we went to Japan, so I kept a journal from New Zealand all the way through Japan, and I kept a pretty detailed recount of every day. So I thought that I would kind of narrate the footage that I have, kind of combined with journal entries along with just what I can remember, and kind of make a more cohesive video diary, I suppose. I'll either kind of just summarize things that I've written in here, or I might read out direct quotes. We'll see what I feel comfortable with and what actually makes the cut. This is my journal. It has 2 notebooks. The first notebook was just all of the writing. I'm not gonna let you get too close to that, but all the writing here, and then this was like all the scrapbooking. But I actually haven't read many of these pages since coming back, so I think it'll be nice to kind of reflect on the whole trip now through these pages and through making this video. I think I have about 5 or 6 hours of footage, so there's a lot for me to go through. That's why I'm breaking it up into 2 parts, but not to waste any more time, I'm just going to get into it now. So pretty much we started off with Tokyo. We went straight from New Zealand to Tokyo. We landed in Tokyo on the 5th of February. We landed pretty late at night, so we just went straight to bed that night. I did have my first ever convenience store meal, which was awesome. And after traveling from New Zealand, we did have a slight jet lag, which was about 4 hours difference. So this worked in our favor because we were able to naturally wake up earlier and have some good starts that first week in Tokyo. So I think we woke up around 6 a.m. on the first day, and annoyingly I actually did an internship interview that morning, and because it was our first day we didn't really know where to go. We were staying in Osaka, but we had no idea if any cafes were open, and so I ended up having to do this internship interview from a parents' room toilet stall, and I had to sit on the floor with my laptop like hotspotted. It was the most rogue and awful internship interview you could ever imagine. I didn't get the internship either, but that's okay. But it was a very interesting start to our Japan trip. Afterwards we ended up in Ueno Park, and I know there's going to be a bunch of names that I mispronounce. I've tried my best to look up the pronunciation of some of these words, and I'll do it as I go along, just putting that out there. But yeah, we went to Ueno Park, and it wasn't too far from where we were staying in Osaka, and they had all these beautiful trees. I don't think they were cherry blossoms, but they looked quite similar. And they also had swan boats, which are Aunt's favorite. We then headed to the Studio Ghibli Museum, and we stopped for a quick bite at the cutest cafe. Me and Aunt really regret not buying these little postcards from inside there, but it was very close to the museum, so we just went there and had this delicious dry curry with egg is what I wrote. The Studio Ghibli Museum was really cool. It was one of my favorite things that we did in Japan. There were just so many different floors. I think there were 3 or 4 floors and heaps of rooms. Every exhibit or display was super detailed. You got to see kind of the full process on how they made different movies like Ponyo and Kiki's Delivery service, and you'd see like the early drafts and sketches, and then you'd see how they kind of formed that into the movie it is now. And it was just super cool because it showed all of the techniques that they've used since back in the 80s or 90s, I suppose. I'm not even sure. We got to even watch a little short film called Whale Hunt. It was in Japanese, so we didn't really have too much of an idea on what was going on in the movie, but the visuals were very, very pretty, and I was happy enough with that. After Studio Ghibli, we wandered around Musashino and bought a few random knickknacks. I got a stamp book. There were just so many adorable stores. And then we had ramen for dinner. And this was actually my second ever ramen prior to this trip. I think I'd only had maybe one ramen before this. So I had so many more ramens as the Japan trip went on. Next day we then headed to Shinjuku, kind of just to go into some of the camera stores that we'd found online. I ended up getting a really good lens for this camera for $70, which was an insane steal. And naturally, because we were close by, we also headed to the famous Shibuya crossing, which I have to say is overrated, and I already kind of thought that I'd feel that way before going, but I think because it was my first time in Japan, I did just want to see all of the more touristy things anyway. I think it was still kind of fun just seeing all the billboards around that area, and it was just kind of insane. We also then saw the Hachi statue, which I had no idea was in Shibuya, and I watched that film when I was way younger, so it was super exciting to see that. At the beginning of the trip, I wrote a lot in my journal about concerns about trying to fit everything into our numbered days, and I definitely felt this pressure to do everything a lot whilst in Japan, but there's just genuinely so much to see, and it's literally impossible to see everything. So I think once I started to take the stress off myself and accepted we only had so many hours in the day, I was able to chill out a bit in terms of trying to jam pack the days too much. On the 7th of February, I remember it being our coldest day yet. It felt like my fingers were freezing off when we went to the flea market. There were piles of clothes that were all about 200 yen a garment, which were crazy, and it ended up snowing when we were at the market, which was really, really fun. I haven't seen snow prior to Japan since 2009, so it was very special. And apparently it only snows about 2 days a year in Tokyo, so Ant and I were very lucky to get to experience that. Later that day, after the flea market, we got swindled into riding a rickshaw, but it did end up being another one of our favorite moments on the trip. Our tour guide was incredibly charming and taught us about the history in Asakusa and across Japan. He would stop along the way and provide intriguing pieces of information about different buildings and temples. Something I found super interesting was that the direction of northwest is considered bad luck in Japanese geomancy. Apparently it's a cursed direction, and a lot of architecture in Japan is built in a specific way to protect against evil spirits. So for example, doors and windows are constructed to face away from northeast for protection, which I found very interesting. After our rickshaw ride, we were dropped at the Sensoji temple, and we then went to dinner at Ant's family friend's home. I didn't film anything there, but we had one of the most special dinners ever that night. They cooked us traditional tamaki sushi with raw fish and raw meat, which was very big for me because I've never had any raw meat or fish in my life, and under any other circumstances I probably wouldn't have eaten it, but I had to, and I actually am really glad that I did because I enjoyed it. The next morning we woke up to find thick snow had fallen all throughout the night, and now the street was just covered in a blanket of snow. Ant and I and another hostel roommate all went out onto the balcony, feeling like kids waking up to like a white Christmas. It was very, very beautiful. We spent time just taking pictures and running around in the street, Again, I hadn't seen snow since 2009, so I felt very childlike.
It's not super crazy.
Later we then travelled to Kamakura, and we did run into a bit of a frustration with our Apple Maps telling us the wrong train to get on. So I had a crash out, but after travelling about an hour in the wrong direction, we did eventually arrive, and we got to see the giant Buddha, which was amazing. It was so big. I don't think the footage that I got really shows how big the Buddha was. And we even got to go inside the Buddha, which I didn't know you could do, but it was super cool. And I just couldn't believe that it was still standing from like the 13th century, and it has stayed standing through like countless natural disasters. There were a bunch of signs that I was reading about it. We then explored the town, and we came across the most gorgeous music box store that was decorated with a bunch of Tiffany lamps, and me and Aunt love a Tiffany lamp, so we were just taking pictures throughout that whole store. Aunt and I also became pretty obsessed with music boxes on this trip, but more on that to come in part 2 of the video diary. We then made our way down to the beach, and I was super shocked to find people surfing in the ocean when it had literally been snowing in the morning, and there was still snow covering the beach and covering the streets behind us. But the beach was super nice. I saw a cute lady and her cute dog. On the way home from Kamakura, we did run into a bit of bad luck when Aunt dropped her phone in one of the train stations, and it completely broke and wouldn't turn back on. So on the way to the Apple store, we stopped at Character Street in Tokyo Station and then headed to the Apple store, but they weren't able to do anything because of annoying Apple rules, and they basically would have had to reset Aunt's phone. So Aunt went phoneless for the night, but we continued to do a little bit of sightseeing and make the most of the day. We walked to the Imperial Palace only to find that it was closed. You'll soon come to find that Aunt and I ran into this time and time again across Japan, showing up to places and then being closed. But we then headed to the Tokyo Tower, and it was very pretty lit up at night.
Now just hold him up to your face.
Our next day was spent primarily op shopping, so I decided to leave my big camera back at the hostel, and I just got some footage on my phone and digicam, so don't mind the change in quality. But we spent the morning back at the Sensoji Temple and the surrounding areas. We went to a few stores in the arcades that surrounded the Sensoji Temple. I also got a hot chocolate with my dog's face on it, which was the cutest and most adorable hot chocolate to ever exist. We then headed off to countless thrift stores in various suburbs, just kind of finding stuff on the map and heading into the different areas. We also went and got Aunt's phone fixed in one of these suburbs. I found that the thrifting was a bit hit or miss for me personally, just because Japan only seems to stock the clothing of whichever season it is, which meant that I could only really find jumpers, cardigans, and long clothing. However, I only really wear that clothing a few months of the year in Australia, so I had been wanting to find warmer clothing for the warmer seasons. But that being said, I did still find some pretty awesome things that day of thrifting. After thrifting, we then of course took ourselves to tea lapse because I think it's just a rite of passage for your first Japan trip. Again, one of those more touristy things, but I loved it so much. I had so much fun. It was super interactive and it was super pretty. There were so many rooms. Halfway through we thought that we were nearly done, and then we found out that there were 2 whole other experiences that we hadn't even seen yet, so we had to rush it. But if you're gonna go to Team Labs, definitely give yourself a lot of time, because we definitely could have used like 3 or 4 hours. I'm not actually too sure which Team Labs we went to, but I know it was the one with the water, which a lot of people seem to kind of hate on, but I actually love taking my shoes off and walking through the water and going through the koi fish. I think that might have been one of my favorite rooms. I also just love the room with all the light bars because it would match up with the music that was playing and it felt very magical in there.
That's still so annoying.
On the way home from Team Labs, we then splurged and booked an Uber, only for myself to put in the wrong hotel with the exact same name and same suburb, but apparently there's 2 of the same hostels. Who would have thought? So then Ant and I ended up actually having to walk home anyway, but the view was nice at least. Mount Fuji Day, another classic rite of passage for Japan, and we sat like sardines in a packed train all the way there. It was insanely gorgeous, and we were very lucky with the timing because of the recent snow. There was still heaps in the area that day we were there. We headed straight to this music park that Ant missed out on the last time she was in Japan, so we made it #1 priority for the day, only to arrive and discover that the music park is open every single day of the week except Tuesdays. Such a random day to be closed, but we didn't even think to check. We then looked in from the outside and dreamed of what could have been. Maybe Ant will finally get to go to the music park on her 3rd trip to Japan someday. We then climbed the Arakuyama Senjin Park to admire the views of Mount Fuji with the temple and city all below. And then in the distance, whilst up on the mountain, we spotted an amusement park and headed straight there because Ant and I love an amusement park. And I just think that there's something so special about amusement parks lit up at night. The entire atmosphere was very magical and thrilling, and you could see the mountain in the background, like behind the silhouette of the roller coasters. It was so cute, and it was all French themed and inspired by Lisa and Gaspard, which is this little cartoon. And me and Ant went crazy in the gift shop. I didn't even know about Lisa and Gaspard before we went to the amusement park, but now it was like we were under a trance and we had to buy everything possibly we could. With the discovery of the amusement park, we were definitely able to heal the wound left by the absence of the music park. This was also our last day in Tokyo, so I think we finished it off on an extremely high note. I didn't film much of the next day, which was mostly spent just traveling to Hakuba. It was a bit problematic. We did wake up to find Ant's phone just simply would not turn on after she had already spent $200 getting it fixed that thrift shopping day. We also hadn't booked tickets in advance, which was definitely our fault because we are just very disorganized travelers. In brackets I wrote whoops, but eventually we got to Hakuba. The travel into Nagano and then eventually into Hakuba was very, very much gorgeous. I feel like I wrote gorgeous about 1,000,000 times in my journal, but this was extra gorgeous. The snow was very thick here, like way thicker than it had been in Tokyo, and I believe there had been a snowstorm right before we arrived, so this probably added to it. We were only in Hakuba for 2 nights, so we definitely made the most of it immediately. We checked into our room and then literally went straight back out into the snow to make snow angels and throw snowballs at each other. We then headed into town and had a delicious dinner. We tried a matcha, and wow, this is just making me miss the food in Japan so much, and miss the price of eating out in Japan so much. Actually, Hakuba was a bit more expensive though, I will say. We inevitably ended up in an arcade because Japan seems to have one on every corner, and Ant played about 10 rounds on a claw machine because of course, and it was most definitely rigged.
Oh my god! Grab it! Grab it! Oh, you got it!
Because we were only staying 2 nights in Hakuba, we only really had 1 full day, so we wanted to make the most of it. So we headed to the ski slopes straight away and inquired about ski lessons. As you may have guessed by the pattern occurring throughout this video, Ant and I didn't book prior, and therefore all skiing lessons were booked out for the entire day, which meant that Ant and I had to endeavor to learn snowboarding instead, which people do say is a lot harder to learn but apparently easier to master. But there is no way that I could ever master snowboarding, let me tell you that. Snowboarding was so hard. It took so much balance and so much strength, and I just remember the craziest burning on my calves. When going down the mountain, you either have to go facing forwards on your heels or backwards on your toes. Our instructor told us that most find it easier to do heels, but I felt completely the opposite. I could not master heels at all, but I did love going down on my toes backwards. For some reason it felt so much safer, maybe because I could just fall on my knees if I lost balance. But the lesson was super fun and our instructor was awesome. She gave us a bunch of recommendations as well and took videos of us. We did have some insane falls and some injuries, but luckily nothing too crazy. Ant and I, you may have guessed it, never got around to purchasing travel insurance, so wow, things could have gone differently. After our lesson, we rewarded ourselves with crepes and a delicious ramen for dinner. We then went back to our hotel and watched Frozen, which was super relevant, of course. The next day was a travel day, so really we only had 1 full day in Hakuba. Although we did only have the 1 full day, I think it was enough for us. We were very exhausted after our first day of snowboarding, and I think we were playing with destiny with the whole no travel insurance thing. And we were just happy to see the great magnitude of snowy mountains in that regional area. us to the end of part 1 of my video diaries on Tokyo and Hakuba and all the places in between. And in the next video I'll now be discussing Kyoto and Osaka, just because there's so much more in this journal and even more so on the camera, and I thought it'd just be nice to split them up. But thank you for watching this first part of my video diary, and I hope that you tune in to the second part.